to you. So we are thrilled to welcome Nina Marie Lister to the third speaker in our speaker series about biodiversity and design. And Nina Marie is a professor and graduate director at the School of Urban and Regional Planning at Ryerson, and the director of Ecological Design Lab, as well as the founding principal of PLANDFORM. So she is in many fields, in ecology, in planning, in design. And I think what makes Nina Marie stand apart from many others is that she truly moves with dexterity and intelligence across these fields. She is a registered planner. She's a frequent collaborator on design teams, and has both lectured widely and taught widely, and now currently teaching a seminar at the GSD. Most recently, and I can mention this because I was on my way to being part of the celebration of a prize she won called the Margulies National Design for Living Prize. Nina Marie was awarded this in the fall. It's a very, very big deal. It celebrates a Canadian designer whose work in the built environment improves the lives of people and communities. So, Nina Marie, thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me, Julia. I really am inspired by the series that you've put together and by its timeliness, and I hope that I'll add some value. I will also, I think I'm very fortunate to be at this position in the series because I had the pleasure of hearing my colleagues Richard Weller and Christina Hill previously, who really touched on some of the things that I'll speak about today, but in a slightly different way, and I hope move the conversation forward. So with that, I'm going to share my screen and we'll get started. I think, Julia, about 45 minutes or so, is that
Perfect.
right?
That's perfect. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I might move around a little bit in the talk. We'll just see how people are doing. I don't know that I'm very good at taking the temperature of the room, so to say, but people will let me know if they have questions in the chat and I can come back to those afterwards if I may. So, I'm just going to minimize something so that I can't see you very well, but you'll be able to see me, hopefully. Now, how's that looking for you?
Perfect.
Great. Today, I thought I would take some of the work that I've been doing and experimenting on with students and move it forward to discuss not so much design applications this time, because there are lots of designers who are speaking with you who are going to do that. Instead, I thought I would reflect on some of those applications and move a conversation to a place that takes us into the gradient between culture and nature and asks questions about what it is to be wild in between those spaces, so that we can design not only from and for biodiversity, but also towards a caring and compassionate relationship with the world that will have implications for design and, frankly, for all the work that we do. So I'm interested in, if I can move my screen, where did it go? I'm interested in taking us forward, but I think I'll set the tone by letting you know a little bit about where I speak from. Right now, I'm in Toronto, also called Toronto, and I'm at a university that is engaged in a very deep and political as well as cultural process of being renamed. And our university and my research lab are in the city of Toronto, or Toronto, which is in what's called the Dish with One Spoon territory. The Dish with One Spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe peoples, the Mississaugas, the Haudenosaunee, that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans and all newcomers, have been invited into this treaty, we're told, in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. But I'd like to acknowledge that my university has directly harmed and continues to affect Indigenous peoples across Canada and across Turtle Island. By acknowledging and teaching about these harms, we educate ourselves and others to ensure that this history never repeats itself. So it's only when we're accountable for the past that we can move forward in reconciliation between the university and Indigenous peoples. And so that is why I will begin this way, by saying very clearly that I'm grateful to live and to work here and to be sustained and nourished by these lands and waters. And so I offer my gratitude and my respect to the elders past and present. My ecological design lab is really investigating 3 trajectories that are relevant here, but one in particular. We work tangibly and specifically on landscape connectivity. So how to reconnect landscapes that have been taken apart or fragmented by roads and by sort of conventional development. And that's a project of ecological science as much as it is of design. The second trajectory is more broadly about green and blue infrastructure, purpose-designed infrastructure that has a living component and that serves biological, ecologically, and social cultural functions. And then the third trajectory is about conceptually and heuristically about resilience as a concept that underlies the way in which we plan for landscapes. And today, the work that I do actually transcends these 3 trajectories. And I hope you will find some value in how it might inform design. You can have a look at our website if you're interested in some of this work. Julia's mentioned some of it, but I'd like to focus on the viewer's right-hand side of the screen that takes some of this work into new territory and explores together with colleagues at the Harvard GSD what we call wild ways of thinking, ways of moving, and ways of being and relating to the wild and nature in the Anthropocene. And we ask questions about what this means. It's not as simple as we might think. I'm really have the pleasure of being engaged with very thoughtful students at the GSD in this context. Also in a companion studio taught together with Chris Reed, also called Wild Ways, that applies some of this knowledge in the LA Basin area. So this is really some of the thinking that grounds that. And let's just say broadly, the research asks, what are the qualities of the wild and of wildness in the Anthropocene? Do they matter? How do we relate to them? And how might they hinder or help the objectives that we're talking about today to design for the biodiverse? So let's imagine a spectrum that traditionally through Western thinking, so the institutions that we all learn in here in North America, we could call those Western institutions that are founded on the principles of rational science and of objective thinking. We see culture at one end of the spectrum and something we call nature in air quotes at the other. And sometimes we might call that wilderness, but I'd suggest to you that there's a middle ground. So when I say thinking betwixt culture and nature and the wild between, I'm suggesting that the wild is neither one nor the other. It has qualities of both. In other words, it's a social construct. It's something we've made, and yet we see it as other. We're not sure where it lies. And that's really what's underlying this course that I'm talking about and the concepts that we're going to talk about today. So in thinking about biodiversity, I'd suggest that the dictionaries that we use tell us that wild means something which is not domesticated or cultivated. So it suggests the opposite of design, intention, and ambition. It's perhaps inhospitable, some dictionaries say, and most concerning, or let's say disconcerting to me, is a definition that suggests wild places are uninhabited. And this is problematic because we know that no place on Earth is uninhabited over time. And I'll come back to that momentarily. And so I'd suggest that there's an emerging definition of wild, both in the work that my students and I are doing and by others in the environmental humanities. I know Richard Weller touched on some of this in his lecture, but I'd say that in vernacular, we could say wild might be that which does not need humans. And that middle image suggests this. The elk crossing a road in a very urbanized condition. They may be even acclimatized to people, but they don't need us. And maybe there's a quality in that relation that's important to explore. In fact, many scientists in the Western tradition also recognize that if we're going to talk about climate recovery in a meaningful way, we have to think about the role of biodiversity. We know that they're inextricably intertwined, and in fact, as climate changes, we exacerbate the biodiversity loss around us. And the way towards recovery, as some have posited, actually calls into being wild places, calls into how we might understand them with qualities that might be a little different than in the past. And this, of course, article, this appeared in the New York Times, was the last article that E.O. Wilson published before his death. And as one of the most famous ecologists in the world, he's quite well cited for arguing for biodiversity conservation in a particular way. And I'd argue there is a different way we might proceed that's emerging, both in the environmental humanities, traditional ecological knowledge, and other forms of knowing. Let me also remind us that biodiversity is more than the biological. We are also part of it. And it's well understood, and certainly in anthropology and in some aspects of ecology, that cultural diversity is biodiversity, and biodiversity needs cultural diversity. And I'd suggest that, for example, linguistic diversity, in the work that I've done over the last 20 years, linguistic diversity through anthropology is very much part of biological diversity and cultural diversity. As we lose languages, we lose the capacity to express ourselves in more nuanced and meaningful ways that are closely tied to places. And so if we're going to protect biological diversity outside of a test tube or a seed bank, we need culture. Winona LaDuke's very well-known work, All Our Relations, in 1999, now quite an old publication, but very relevant. She says there's a direct relationship between the loss of cultural diversity and the loss of biodiversity. Wherever Indigenous people still remain, there is also a corresponding enclave of biodiversity. Trickles of rivers still running in the Northwest are home to the salmon being sung back by Native people. The last few Florida panthers remain in the presence of traditional Seminoles, hidden away in the great cypress swamps of the Everglades. Remnant pristine forest ecosystems from the northern boreal forest to the Everglades largely overlap with Native territories. This from All Our Relations. And I'll come back to some of this in how we think about moving design for the biodiverse forward with a different way of knowing, being, and relating. And that touches on the qualities of what we call wild, but which we might see differently. This image, of course, famous for helping us to understand what urbanization looks like. We can see here a part of North America, at least, that is lit by night, indicating where our most urbanized areas lie. And in the Anthropocene, we know that, in fact, the whole world, and particularly the North, is highly cultured, highly urbanized, highly developed. In fact, more people live in cities now than ever before. So we know this, and these maps are revealing in that they give a sense of our footprint. And they also reveal something else that has been widely recognized over the past, I would say in the last 5 years, but especially in the last few, the work of Earl Ellis and others, who recognize that for the last 12,000 years, since the last glacial interval, the human presence is across the entire planet. There's no part of the planet that doesn't have humans. And so for us to say that biodiversity is important also recognizes the embedded cultural qualities in biodiversity are also important. How that happens is very interesting, and I think important to think about as we move forward with conservation. Conservation of biodiversity is largely a Western scientific undertaking that has been very active for the last century, and particularly born out of a North American tradition and valuing something we call the wild or the wilderness, or what is traditionally known as places not for people. And yet, if we look at the human footprint on the planet and we understand the roles of Indigenous peoples connected to biodiversity, we might ask ourselves how we could see differently. Is the role of science the only role here? Or is there a different way of knowing that is equally important to measure and to make sense of? So I'd argue and have argued that how we see is what we count, which is actually what matters to us culturally. So what if we learned to see differently? What if we used our eyes in different ways? We could ask questions of who counts and who matters, and what counts and what matters. In fact, we're doing that. There are many social reckonings happening at the moment, from Black Lives Matter to anti-systemic racism to anti-Asian racism programs to Indigenous resurgence at my own university. This calls us to see differently in how we act. And I would argue strongly that that is also part of how we need to work with biodiversity. What do we see when we look at these images? Do we see a city, or do we see a living landscape? These are images of Toronto, by the way, both taken from a slightly different perspective. Both are true. Both of these qualities are there. But what we see determines what we value, which in turn determines what we save and how we relate to other life forms and to landscape itself. And this might be the basis for something emerging that is known as more than human design, or some would say design for coexistence, a word that to me sets a rather low bar, rather like tolerance. I hope that I do more than tolerate my neighbor. In fact, I hope I do more than just coexist. I think the word entanglement, which is also used by writers like Donna Haraway, Robin Wall Kimmerer, Suzanne Simard, many others. This word entanglement suggests a relationship that is intimate between life and landscape. And that is what I posit is part of thinking about what we mean by the wild. How do we untangle or perhaps entangle ourselves with this concept? In fact, images that suggest entanglement are all around us. And it's sometimes interesting to look at these images to ask who is watching who. This is a snowy owl, a very famous image now spotted by a Montreal traffic camera that went viral on Twitter some years ago. And it's beautiful for several reasons. I mean, if you've never seen a snowy owl, it's kind of dramatic. And at the same time, the owl knows the camera is there because the owl has circled the camera multiple times and the owl is looking at the camera. It suggests a relationship that perhaps isn't captured by traditional methods of counting species that we use for biodiversity, for example. Or this very old image now, a Maxwell image out of Portland, Oregon in 2002, the Western coyote riding the subway or the tram. This is a confusing image to us. There's a wild animal in a very public space, but what does wild mean in this context? This is an animal very well adapted to a city. And nevertheless, if we use Emma Maris's definition of the wild, doesn't need humans. I don't think the coyote needed to take the tram. I think the coyote got lost probably, but it's an image that confuses our identities and our relationships to ideas of wild. Similarly, there's recent and more emerging ecological evidence that suggests what we think of as individual species might actually be families or communities. In fact, community ecology is an old science, probably more than 100 years old now. But more recently, this has infiltrated how we make sense of extractive landscapes. The forestry community of science was not welcoming to a scholar who understood that trees communicate through gaseous exchange or the exchange of gases to actually assist one another in a community with providing nutrients. And that research was, as I said, not welcome initially, but now is the basis for a whole other branch of forest ecology. The vernacular translation of Suzanne Simard's research is in Finding the Mother Tree, for example. Similarly, we find the same research emerging in Entangled Life, or even Michael Pollan's work about how to change your mind, how fungi inhabit the world, and the ways in which this kingdom of neither animal nor plant is entangled and bound up with our forest communities and, in fact, our own biology. This leads us to ask questions about how we see in terms of science. How are we making sense of a world that is incredibly complex and rich in terms of not only species, but their relationships? And I suggested for you before this lecture that you may wish to read Robin Wall Kimmerer's 2013 book, Braiding Sweetgrass. One short chapter in it relates directly to thinking differently and asking questions of how we know and how we measure. This is not to suggest that Western science isn't a useful tool. Of course it's useful, it's how we make sense of the world, but it is one way, and it's been the dominant way in conservation science. And what Kimmerer is suggesting is that there are other ways of knowing that help us see differently, especially in times of urgency and risk. And the summary here is that goldenrod and asters appear very similarly to bee eyes and to human eyes. The colors are very specific, this beautiful pairing of golden and purple, yellow and purple, which humans also find beautiful. This is a picture, interestingly, or maybe not so interestingly, from my garden. I paired this long before I read Robin Wall Kimmerer's book, but of course I did so because it appears in nature and because as an ecologist, I knew the science behind this. I knew that the pairing of these colors to pollinating species actually result in greater pollination between the two types of plants than if they were planted individually. There's a kind of a mutualism here that happens. So Robin Wall Kimmerer says we both think they're beautiful, both bees and humans. Their striking contrast when they grow together makes them a beacon for bees. Growing together, they both receive more pollinator visits than they would if they were growing alone. It's a testable hypothesis and in fact has been tested. It's a question, she says, of science, but also of art, design, and beauty. It's this dance, as she describes it, of cross-pollination that can produce a new species of knowledge, a new way of being in the world. And this September pairing of purple and gold is what she calls lived reciprocity. It's wisdom that is beyond that is the beauty of one and illuminated by the radiance of the other. Science and art, indigenous knowledge and Western science, can they be asters and goldenrod for each other? So I'd suggest with this thinking that we might move from conservation science to two-eyed seeing. What my indigenous colleagues call two-eyed seeing is seeing with the whole of the self, with lived experience and knowledges that we build and make and that are rigorous, like conservation science. And this moves us to a place we might call relational ecology, that we can relate to the other, who is actually, as it turns out, part of us. Our culture is part of biodiversity. And in the urban century, as it's called, or the Anthropocene, we know that we as humans are dominating the planet, one species dominating all the others with whom we are, I would argue, deeply entangled. Even if we think that the elk in this foreground are other species, they're part of the urban fabric in Canmore, Alberta, just as the coyote and the squirrel are bound in this perhaps unfortunate relationship for the squirrel. They're bound up in the urban condition, and they are in fact adapted to us. Richard Weller's work has been very helpful in mapping the conflict zones between urban development, or in the Anthropocene, and biodiversity. He spoke a little bit about that project in his lecture. And I'd say that Christina Hill also offered us a way of thinking about how these intersections lie on the land that may offer insights for design for biodiversity. And she used the examples in California she referred to around fire, but I'm going to speak about them more broadly insofar as conservation science is concerned for protecting biodiversity more globally. We know that there are species around the world, some of them that I've had the pleasure of working with. In this particular example, what's called the Hollywood cougar, P22, is part of our Wildways studio. We're thinking about how this large cat, this apex predator, moves through the California, in fact, the Hollywood Hills, but in California more broadly, and intersects regularly with people. This has some interesting design implications, as do leopards in Mumbai, this in a national park, but in the city, has a routine intersection with people that is not always safe for people. This is an image that also confuses us, perhaps. We don't expect to see giraffe with Nairobi in the background. But they're once again indicators, as is the elk image I showed earlier, that our ideas about wild species are confused and maybe confounded when they are on literally a collision course with our own development. Do we keep them out because they are others, or do we design for their movement, sometimes hidden in plain sight in our cities? Some of the work that I do is particularly concerned with an increase in roads, which fragment and divide habitats, and we look to design solutions to overcome these. This is globally a collision course with biodiversity, something that, again, Richard Weller's work deals with specifically. But before I do that, I would just remind us that when we're talking about biodiversity, this is a complicated and a complex term. And I think it's useful at this juncture to just offer some guidance to how we might think about it. So we typically mean the abundance and total variety of all types of life on Earth, but that's at different scales. At the genetic scale, that's one kind of diversity. So diversity within even a species or a population. Species diversity is themselves, so the different types of wildlife, that includes plants and animals and fungi. Oh, and algae. So there are many different species on Earth in these kingdoms, and they're all different from one another. And so too is their abundance and their frequency, and that's ecological diversity types of habitats. So it means not just numbers of types of things, but also distribution, richness, how they're clustered together, abundance, and cultural diversity, increasingly cultures within those species. Mostly we think that's just humans, but of course we also know that the great apes have culture, according to anthropologists, and people would also say the cetaceans do. Maybe there are more. But what I'd leave you with at this point, without going into further detail, is to say that biodiversity is complicated because there's also diversity within and between the different species. the different taxa and populations. And I'll give you some examples in cities as we move a little bit more forward. Of course, what we know is that just like the International Panel on Climate Change has a consensus of hundreds of scientists that recognize we are changing the climate with our practices on the planet, so too are we causing the sixth great extinction, the loss of many species, potentially up to 1 million in the next decade. And that, of course, is a trick question to ask. How many are we losing? Because we don't actually know how many there are. We do not know with any precision how many species on the earth there are, but we know we're losing them. So when we talk about biodiversity specifically for conservation, in the popular press and the media, and even in some of our poetic writings, we talk about nature generally. But there's another term that I mentioned at the very beginning of the lecture, and that's biophilia. E.O. Wilson's term, actually, that suggests all human beings, intersectionally across cultures, all have some innate connection to nature. And I'd suggest that it goes beyond that. It's actually about how we relate to nature. Biophilia is a concept that can offer us insight into how, as human species and human cultures, we relate to other species. And that relationship is critical to our survival. It's critical to our survival together with biodiversity. Why care? Well, I apologize that for some of you, these images may be very disturbing. We care out of compassion in sometimes, and also increasingly because we're concerned about the connection of loss of other species to our own survival. But compassion is part of the discussion. These images suggest that, whether it's wildlife collisions on roads, the loss of last species, this incredibly powerful image of the last white rhino dying in captivity with his keeper beside him. These images compel us to think about our relationship with species more than human. And of course, this is also because life itself exists on a very thin band. If you think about how the earth is, how life on earth is shared, it's just to say that a very thin band of literally meters. The greatest biodiversity on earth is between essentially the tops of the trees and the organic layer of the soil. And that's a kind of an astonishing band of life that provides all of these services to us, what some have called ecosystem services. To me, it's a very utilitarian term. It's like suggesting places on earth are uninhabited, as though no one is there. As a planner, I'm very attuned to this because my profession calls upon me, even in our code of practice, to think about how we use land. And some years ago, I stopped being able to refer to land use in good conscience. I don't just use land. I live with it, and it supports me and my family and my community. And that relationship is critical. It's not simply an extractive relationship where I take services provided for free, but rather I relate to those other species that provide living assistance, you might say. Others have called these nature-based solutions. So what we could say is that all of the functions of the biosphere, which we can measure and evaluate empirically in our many good sciences, these range from habitats to the provision of clean water, clean air, food for ourselves, cooling our temperatures, regulating the biomes that we live in, and so on. But in 4 broad categories, we talk about these as the supporting, the provisioning, the regulating, and the cultural services, in air quotes, of biodiversity. We could just look at even one of these many services that is provided without fee to people, and that is, again, the work of the bees and many other species, is pollination of our crops, for example. So these services are critical, or these solutions to biodiversity are critical in thinking about how we conserve this abundant source of other, abundant species of other life forms on the planet. And E.O. Wilson, in some of his last work, proposed that we ought to set aside half the planet for nature. And you heard a little bit about this in your first lecture from Richard Weller, and he's provided lots of good reasons why, if we just measure that, it would be hard to do, and it would be interesting about what that looks like. Not so much the half the planet, but even what we've already committed to. So under our global conventions, and let's just look at the United Nations for a moment, in the most recent incarnation of the Convention on Biological Diversity, we are told that we have to protect at least 30% of the biodiversity on the planet. First, in 2020, it was 17%. And using mostly Western-based conservation science, we didn't do so well. Canada to date is at about 11.4%. I mean, we have a very large country, that's true, with relatively low population. And that's not just about Canada, of course, it's about a commitment to global climate protection and global biodiversity. Similarly, Brazil didn't do so well, and the United States didn't sign the convention. So you can see that there might be some problems with this measuring and setting aside of certain percentages. The Half-Earth Project makes much of this, noting that we didn't come anywhere close to meeting 17%. I think in Richard's lecture, he gave us just over 15%, which I think is the current number. Hard to imagine how we'll get to 30% by 2030. And the Half-Earth Project has gained popular momentum. Mostly, I would argue that it's about the idea of relating to nature for its protection. Whether it's 50% or 30% or 15%, of course, matters very much on who is involved in that protection. Most of the work that I do relates to connecting landscapes for the purposes of creating complex, redundant systems of movement, recognizing that there are some problems with this depending on where it happens. Richard Buller proposed World Park as one of the solutions, and I work closely with these ideas of connectivity on a continental scale. I can't speak to the world, but I can certainly speak to work in North America. Work by organizations like the Yellowstone to Yukon Network or by the Large Landscape Conservation Organization. These are all understanding that animals and plants need freedom to roam and to move. And as Christina Hill pointed out in her lecture, this is also exacerbated under climate change, where we all need to move. We may need to retreat from our habitats and find new ones or new sources of food as our habitats change. Weller's image of urbanization on the planet contrasted with this wonderful projection of conservation at approximately 15% gives you a very clear sense of where connectivity is positive for urbanization and negative for conservation. So this is also an understanding that we have about bringing back species to the land, that is to say, giving them safe passage. A movement known as rewilding is in full play in Europe, which has lost most of its what we would have called wild places, places not requiring humans. And many of the species that go with that, feral species, are those, just like this lecture, that are neither cultivated nor wild. They're somewhere in between. And rewilding the land is a movement that is closely connected to restoration ecology. And I provide some distinction between these for you because they're related but different concepts. On viewers' left-hand side of the screen, we might say that restoration is very much focused on management, management of human activities, of land-based practices. I'm not going to say land use, but land-based practices. And it implies that there is some kind of idealized ecosystem state that we might be able to know and somehow fix that. So it implies a kind of reset or a fix, which in turn implies something that's broken. Many people might acknowledge that our ecosystems are broken, but if you are a person who lives on the land, you might see it a little bit differently. The other thing that the restoration movement has typically done is it's rooted in a kind of settler colonial perspective through American conservation organizations. And it also has kind of embedded an idea that we can preserve, something like pickling or keeping static a condition of ecosystem, of some ecosystem that we wish. So if it's bound in time, the more difficult question becomes where. It implies that there's some kind of baseline knowable conditions. And it becomes problematic when we engage a debate about native species and invasive species, or species that have a tendency to take over. I would say those species are often just very successful, but at the expense of others. Rewilding, on the other hand, shown on the viewer's right-hand side of the screen, tends to be more about grassroots organizations that accept a position of where we are now and moving forward. Definitely, there are aspects of ecosystem restoration within rewilding, but it tends to be accepting of this sort of shifting baseline of urbanization and recognizes and embraces the changes that are happening. It also tends to be activist oriented, understanding that we might regenerate degraded ecosystems. But I think it's somewhat positive in that it moves us away from the idea that there is a pristine, wild other nature out there, and instead says, look, we're part of this. There might be a possibility to create places that are beyond the everyday urban human's reach, but that are essential to those who live on the land or traditional land keepers. Most importantly, I'd say it's also colonial and post-colonial ideas that are embedded in rewilding. Tends to be right now Eurocentric because that's where a lot of this activity is happening. But it's something to consider in how we implement biodiversity conservation. Both of these concepts, restoration on the one hand, rewilding on the other, are related. And the idea of wildness, not wilderness, but wildness, qualities of the wild, or that which does not need humans, are embedded in both. And they both assume the qualities of the wild as a goal. And of course, that's something that designers might think about in the ways in which they give traction to the concepts around biodiversity protection. Again, an image that is shocking to us, but this coyote on the side of the road is to me a very emblematic image of thinking differently. We need to find ways of moving together in our habitats that don't cost the other the way that this image suggests. It's also an image that we use in the work that I do with ARC Solutions, the Animal Road Crossing Project. It's a very literal image to move us towards thinking about conservation that is entangled, that is complex, and that engages people on the land with the species with whom they coexist. And this in turn suggests that there are very different ways to do conservation. I suggested to you earlier that at 15% thereabouts of conservation of other species through the IUCN's goal, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, and the United Nations initiatives, the Convention on Biological Diversity, we have not done very well. We're at just about 15% when we said we were going to be at 20, now we're going for 30. We're not doing well. Why? Because most of the world's conservation strategies have tended to be based on the same principles of extraction. In other words, we use a kind of science-based approach to draw circles around the areas we see as uninhabited or othered, and we suggest that those are good places for conservation. And again, the numbers don't bear that out. In fact, when you look at where conservation of biodiversity is most successful, as I said in the introduction to this lecture, they tend to be in places closely connected to people who live on the land. And collaborative conservation strategies with people who live on the land, particularly cultural groups who live sustainably in their natures, indigenous communities using traditional ecological forms of knowing, and those cultural values that respect other species, those are where we see the highest conservation achievement. So if we just look right now, the last 2 years have shown repeated studies, in fact, a very good study by Ryerson et al. In 2018, and then later from the United Nations Local Biodiversity Team, they showed very clearly that Indigenous peoples are essential to conservation success. If we're going to design for the biodiverse, we absolutely have to do it with people, and specifically people that we have traditionally marginalized or pushed out of their traditional lands. Comprising less than 5% of the world's population, Indigenous peoples right now around the globe actually protect 80% of global biodiversity. That's an astonishing and disproportionate figure. And it should tell us that we cannot continue to use conventional extractive methods by taking people out of the picture and their resources. And we must, in fact, work together with people in different ways. And this research is very powerful. It's not something that, I think we've known this intuitively, especially those of us who work with community on the land, but it's very important to see it publicly. We also know, right now we're experimenting in Canada, which is a very late adopter of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, I'd say. But because we have such a very large land base, the Canadian government has finally, I would argue, finally recognized that working with Indigenous peoples to meet our biodiversity conservation goals is not only essential, but long overdue. And we have engaged the first in the last few years of Indigenous protected and conserved areas. These are areas that are Indigenous led and kept. And these are, I would say, a very important new method of protecting land, new meaning that the United Nations recognizes what they call indigenous protected areas, and as well as other effective environmental measures of protection that can include urban areas, but we need indigenous peoples to do so. Here's an interesting study that I think I'm not sure if I put this on the reading list, but it's part of this series of recognition of the role of indigenous peoples. This is a research study that came with a very large group out of the University of British Columbia 2 years ago by Schuster et al., recognizing that vertebrate diversity on indigenous managed lands in not only Canada, but Australia and Brazil is at least equal to that in the most biodiversity hotspot protected areas. And we see this in community when we work with indigenous peoples. And it's not enough to go in and learn from indigenous peoples, but rather to sit with and understand how that knowledge is kept. This is not something you can extract either. My indigenous colleagues would remind me, and they do, that it's not enough to come in and listen and take that strategy and put it into place elsewhere, but rather that traditional knowledge keepers are the holders of knowledge that is important to place. It's in place, you can't extract it. And that's something that I think Western science has not been good at understanding very well. This is also a commitment for me personally and for my university to the process of truth and reconciliation in my country. And we've seen it very successful in other countries as well, particularly, this is a model, of course, that came out of South Africa. But indigenous reconciliation is more than making amends. It's about moving forward on separate paths together. And this might even be called resurgence, as it is in my own university, a resurgence of recognition and respect for indigenous knowledge. We bring this into workshops with our indigenous knowledge keepers who share with us. We have, I would say, in the city of Toronto where I work, finally established an indigenous council within the city that, or an advisory body that has yet to really be given traction in policy, but in workshops at least is helping us establish collaborative working relationships. I would return for a moment again to the place where my knowledge is kept in a university in Toronto, and our namesake, the founder of the university, Egerton Ryerson, was one of the architects of the residential school system that took indigenous people out of their culture, out of their place, separated children from parents, forced them to speak English and to learn religion other than their own. And while he also founded a public education system, he publicly declared it was not fit for indigenous peoples, and they not for it. And so this is part of the reason that undergoing a reconciliation act of name changing can allow us to move forward with different types of knowledge for the purposes I'm talking about today and others. The head of the statue now sits on a spike some distance from the university. It's a powerful image. It's part of the land back movement. And now it is sitting on the reclamation camp set up by the Six Nations of the Grand River in Caledonia. An image to think about as we talk about what a new agenda might be for conservation. Just like in Habitat 3 in 2017, we learned that the new urban agenda must include biodiversity. So there are ways to move forward that are inclusive and yet perhaps take us out of our comfort zones, help us to see and think differently. The last portion of this talk, I hope, will give us some ideas for moving forward. I've written a lot about hybridity and ecosystems that are urbanizing and novel, where it's not perhaps any more helpful to talk about only native species, because if we changed the language a little bit and we talked about who belongs, those conversations would be tremendously inappropriate and uncomfortable. The same is true of species. When we ask where they live and how they belong, we're really asking about ourselves and our relationships to ecosystems that are changing. And in fact, there's lots of research about what it is to be post-wild, kind of a reconciliation of ideas of nature with people in place. Jedediah Purdy's beautiful book, After Nature, brings us to a place of where thinking about other species is deeply political, and where novel ecosystems and those that are still emerging challenge our ideas about what to conserve, what to count, and what to value, and what to save. In the urban areas in North America, there are lots of species that we don't tend to like very much because, in fact, they've adapted to us, whether it's the raccoon, the red fox, or the lost deer downtown. All of these species give evidence that they too are changing and evolving. And this has implications for the way in which we conserve these species or don't. This lovely image from the New York Times a few years back gives us a kind of graphic depiction of hybridity, of change, of fluidity between species that challenges what we mean by wild. What is to be conserved is it not necessarily the same as what we valued in the past. In fact, just this morning in preparation for today's lecture, I was listening to the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation's radio program, The Current, and read a lovely story about a good news story on a day when we all need some, a story of adaptation and a story of compassion. A pod of beluga whales have adopted a stray narwhal. A narwhal, if you're not familiar, is genetically related, but a distinct species where the male has a long helixical or conical tusk extending from the nose. And belugas are, of course, white with a kind of bulging head. You'll find them in the St. Lawrence River between our countries. And it turns out that a narwhal who strayed from his Arctic habitat was taken in by beluga whales. And as this whale is maturing, it's likely, researchers think, that a new hybrid species will result. In fact, we know that the species already does exist. They've been affectionately named narlugas, and they were, not surprisingly, discovered by Inuit hunters in the north, who brought in a strange and unusual species that, as it turned out, is a hybrid between the beluga and the narwhal. But closer to home, we see these hybrids as well. When the coyote meets the wolf, this is a kind of graphic depiction of the lineage, if you will, of the eastern coyote. There's really no such thing. The eastern coyote is actually a hybrid between the western coyote and the eastern wolf. And they're called coy wolves. In fact, what we know now from contemporary research shows that about 50% of the DNA of a coyote, close to 50% of urban coyotes, is actually eastern wolf, which begs the question, if the eastern wolf, which is protected species, at least in my province in Ontario, it's protected, if the eastern wolf, and in particular the gray wolf, but we'll talk about the eastern wolf here, if its DNA is 50% coyote, is it really a wolf? And is it really protected? So this matters because these questions are not about genetics. They're actually about what we value. They're about what we value and how we relate to species that are changing out from under us. This is beautifully depicted in this lovely online atlas by Anna Singh and her colleagues, the Feral Atlas, the More Than Human Anthropocene. I encourage you to have a browse if you're not familiar with it. It also challenges our perceptions of feral, of wild, of domestic, and of who belongs. It also challenges, this discussion, I hope, challenges our ideas about an ecosystem that is somehow out there in service to us, as opposed to other species with whom we are coexisting and entangled in troubled times. Instead, it might help us to think about nature-based solutions, whether that's about designing for green infrastructures that are alive with other species, or landscape infrastructures that provide safe passage, that provide cooling, that provide slowing of floodwaters, that these are investments valuable for us, and they too have a role in conservation. Similarly, when we design such infrastructures and we think about biodiversity in the urban condition, we might think about its role in relation to good living, to a city that is not just barely surviving, but that is in fact thriving and flourishing because it sustains our deep relationship to ideas of nature. So building biophilia, this connectedness with nature. This is my colleague Tim Beatley's work in founding the Biophilic Cities Network, of which I'm really pleased to be a part. We're thinking together across 14 different cities about how to engage biodiversity for human health and well-being, for joy, for flourishing. And of course, there's tremendous evidence growing every day of the benefits of biophilia. That is to say, the benefits of exposure to something we call green or natural. And in fact, wild places within the city are known to provide better physical fitness stimulation, shorter healing and recovery times, reduced stress. We lower cortisol levels in our bodies when we sit outside under a canopy of not just green ornamental trees, but actually mixed diversity. And when we hear bird song, that result is exacerbated. So these benefits are part of the discussion, benefiting, of course, or rather measured by good Western rigorous empirical science, but also based on ways of knowing and being with those species. George Monbiot, the wonderful British journalist, has written a lot about this, particularly as part of the Guardian's climate change series. If you haven't had a look, do. It's wonderful op-eds. In fact, Christina Hill had an op-ed just a couple of weeks ago, right after her lecture, a tremendous, I think, asset for the Academy to have our colleagues writing about urgent action in times that are needed. George Monbiot is doing the same, and of course suggests that we need a different kind of relationship with nature as well. And his result here in this article is really that we need to slow down. We need a slow ecology. Why? Even though in times of urgency and crisis, because that is what's happening around us. To look at other species that have much longer lifetimes in some case gives us a sense of scale, proportion, and opportunity. It also helps us, most importantly, learn to relate, to see differently, and to make those connections. I would also just say that in closing, I want to share with you something, and I hope we have time. I know we're almost at 5. I perhaps have extended time too much. Julia, do we have 3 more minutes? Actually, 1.5 minutes.
Absolutely.
I think this is a kind of fitting closure for this lecture. I want to quote Al Purdy. This is he's a poet who's now gone, but he has deep roots in my home place, in the traditional territories of the Mohawks and the Iroquois, the Six Nation Confederacy. And it's really a call out to reconnecting with the places we've lost, and most importantly, reconnecting with the places we've destroyed, and connecting through their cultures. This is a lovely, lovely poem that I hope inspires you today. So we're going to say the names, because this is where we're going to end the lecture and where I hope we begin a new way of thinking. So let's say the names. There's going to be, hopefully it'll make a bit of noise.
This revolutionary new device can remove up to 10 times more earwax than a traditional
never mind the
cotton swab.
earwax, we're going to skip the ad. There we go.
Sophia Chu, Canterbury High School, Ottawa, Ontario.
Say the Names by Al Purdy. Say the names, and listen to yourself. An echo in the mountains, Tulameen, Tulameen. Say them like your soul was listening and overhearing, and you dreamed you were a river, and you were a river. Tulameen, Tulameen. Not the flat, borrowed imitations of foreign names, not Brighton, Windsor, Trenton, but names that ride the wind. Spillamakeen and Nahani, Clean and Horsefly, Illisilhouette and whatchamacallit, Lillooet and Kluani, head smashed in buffalo jump, and the whole sky falling when the buffalo went down. Similkameen and Nahani. Say them, remember. If ever you wander elsewhere, the north as a deed and forever. Clean, Nahani, Osoyus and Similkameen. Say the names as if they were your soul. Lost among the mountains, a soul you mislaid and found again, rejoicing. Tulameen, Tulameen. Till the heart stops beating. Say the names.
Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you. Wow. Nina Marie, I'm wondering if you could, have a few minutes to talk to us and answer some questions.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. This is a provocation for
Fantastic.
conversation, I hope.
So I'll ask the audience if you'd like to, you can either raise your hand in the chat, or you can write it in the chat. But while you're figuring out your question or comment, I just would like to start with one, if I may. And it's a simple question, but I don't think it has an answer, but I'm going to throw it at you anyway. First of all, amazing lecture, both in terms of disciplinary knowledge and engagement and poetry, as always. So thank you very much for your time and your thoughts. And it seems like wild is a complex concept, and rewilding probably even more so. And given your kind of argument about its relationship to culture, I'm wondering if you think land can rewild on its own, or does it need us to rewild? And I'm thinking of things like, what is part of what counts in part of the 15%? So if you're saying, well, Richard Weller wants us to be, well, it's not him, but we wanted to be at 20, but we're at 15, our target's 30. So there's really two parts to the question. What actually counts in that percentage? And then secondly, when I'm thinking of deindustrializing cities or shrinking cities, places like Detroit or Youngstown, where land is, let's just say, left, does it have the ability to rewild on its own? So two parts to that, but I guess first, can you clarify for me what counts in that percentage target?
Yeah, those are really good questions, Julia, because they'll help frame us thinking about what to do in these contexts. First of all, the protected areas under the IUCN, or that's not a branch of the UN, but an organization adjacent to the UN that has really helped to indicate and study what conservation can do and where it should go. There's 7 categories of protected areas right now. I believe there's 7. And you can read those for yourselves, folks, and see what they are. They range from those that are outright protected, in other words, no form of extraction is permitted, to those that are deeply embedded with extraction of some type. So what seems to be at work in these categories are degrees of protection afforded to the diversity of species. But they've been very criticized for this because they are based on a very Western idea of wilderness as not involving people. And they have also been complicit with, or in other words, places that get protected are sometimes complicit with extraction elsewhere, removing people from their land and their knowledge. So this is not without controversy, but I think the point to emphasize is that there are types of protection that are more successful at protecting a larger variety of species. And the research that I cited in this lecture really clearly showed that Indigenous peoples lead the way, and they lead disproportionately, like much better success with many fewer areas. So, the second part of the question. Well, I guess whether something can rewild on its own depends on your definition of wild. And if we go with Emma Maris's kind of colloquial definition that is probably taken from a variety of anthropological and environmental humanities sources, that which does not require humans, then yes, of course, areas could rewild by themselves. Now, that is not to say that they would have any kind of complement of species that we value. In fact, Julie, if we think back to some of our conversations over the years, we tend, of course, to intervene in ecosystems to get what we want out of them. And that includes protecting species that we find attractive while making sure we get rid of those that we don't like. So that's all encumbered in ideas of what we mean by rewilding.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. So yeah, I'd love to open it up to the audience, both for comments and for questions. So don't be shy.
While somebody is thinking about some questions to ask me, I just wanted to be really clear with something that I hope, I worry a little bit about this in lectures that are when I don't know the student group. And I would just say that, I'm calling to action here ways that I work with my communities on the land. And I don't ever, and nor would I ever speak for Indigenous peoples or really even tell stories about them. Those are stories for individual communities to tell. So what I really want to emphasize that in this work, it calls us to engage with Indigenous partners, collaborators, and communities to understand sometimes that our services might not actually be needed at all.
Exactly. So I'm looking for some questions from our students.
Julia, there's a question in the chat room.
Oh, there is? Okay. How come I won't get it? Hold on.
Oh, I think I see
Oh.
it.
Oh, yeah, here it is. I'm sorry. It says, when an environment being developed not only for humans, but also for other species, do you believe that non-human species are negatively impacted compared to natural selection of species? I'm not sure if I understand exactly that question. Can you read it? And Tony, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I can. I'm not sure I fully understand it either. But that is to say that I think the questioner, you're asking a complex question, actually. I think you're getting at whether we intervene in the process of natural selection when we decide which species to design for. Is that right? Is that part of the question? Yes. Certainly that's true. I think everything we do affects processes of natural selection, sometimes positively, possibly, lots of the time negatively. And I think it's important that this might help. Your question is a good one because it suggests, if the answer is yes, we're always having impacts on other species, that our ambitions might be better placed to manage our own activities. In other words, rather than focusing on managing, like we're pulling levers for other species, rather we manage our activities. That's what we can control. We can control the extent of human activity. And that, of course, has all kinds of social questions as well, where we choose to plan, design, or intervene. But the focus in my world should certainly be on what we're doing with our own activities, rather than let's do this for that species or the other one. Let's think about maybe taking less, unbuilding, retreating sometimes, for example. That's design too.
For sure. Good question, Tony.
Excuse me. Hi, Professor Lister. I do have a question, and my teammate also have a question later. And yeah, first of all, thank you for this amazing lecture. I've literally, after reading your article on LA Plus about building a landscape connectivity, I made my studio project this year, a wildlife overpass. And right, I guess my question is, you're calling for action, but there are those political forces that only understand the language of economy or numbers. So how do you translate the compassion into the language that they understand? And I know this is very hard, so I'm interested in what is your strategy of doing that? Thank you.
Well, that might be the most important question of all, because of course you're right. We have, a very global system of a lot of power. We're seeing it play out horribly all around us, and we can't, in the middle of a war, we can't seem to make decisions that would change things, particularly around who holds money and power. So these are eternal questions to a certain extent, but this should not in any way derail us. I mean, one of the reasons I work in the academy is that I have the great pleasure of working with the next generation of brilliant thinkers who hopefully are inflected with a different kind of approach to decision making. That's one thing, but on a much more practical basis, we can talk very well about designing for wildlife when we also, meaning plants and animals, if we understand how this affects us. And that's one of the reasons that, rather than talking about the free services that nature provides us in the global economy, we might start thinking about how our own survival, our own health and wellness are affected by our ability to protect other species. That's a very, in some ways, a utilitarian thing to say, but actually it comes with I would argue, a good deal of compassion and humility if we're really going to understand the relationship we have with other species, or at least it ought to. And I would say with the wildlife crossing work, we've had more failures than successes by a long shot, but that doesn't stop people from showing where we do have success. And usually it's because there are people engaged in that decision making who understand that there is a benefit to people and that there are intangible values that are reflected in a community beyond that one piece of infrastructure. I mean, we know also that in looking at longer time horizons, we can obtain more good. I would say that the weird side effect of the global pandemic has been that confinement has shown us very clearly that we need equitable access to outdoor spaces that are abundant in biodiversity, or something called nature, which isn't just a row of planted street trees, but has to include birdsong, for example. And if you're in this part of the world where, between Syracuse and Toronto, we're very close to the North American flyway, and people are desperate to hear a songbird come back in March when the weather is terrible, because it actually is connected to a sense of well-being and joy for people. So those are not economic decisions in and of themselves, but they relate directly to our health and wellness. And that's been part of the pandemic recovery. I hope that will weirdly give us a big boost for green infrastructural investment, part of the Green New Deal and part of Building Back Better.
Yeah, great question and great response. We have two more questions, if you don't mind.
Of course.
One is, you seem to suggest, we have three, that invasive plants should not be culled from the landscape, but most of them are, I think it says, bad ecological citizens, not recognized as food by native species, enforcing a monoculture in cases like Phragmites.
Yes, great question. No, I wouldn't suggest that invasive species should not be removed. I would say that the dialogue around restoration can't be only focused on native species. And in fact, I wrote a piece, or actually did an interview that with ASLA quite some time ago, written by Jared Green. And we talked about ecological urbanism. And I made the argument that the restoration movement that focuses almost exclusively on native species, and this is not the same as invasive species, but native species, not non-native species, which are different. That's a risky thing to do, particularly in an urban context. It's almost xenophobic in the way we talk about species belonging in a certain place. It has more to do with the language and the policies that might come out of that discussion. So in certain cases, the Phragmites example is a very good one. It has a tendency to create a monoculture very quickly, and designers have lots of great ideas for how to repurpose Phragmites and to, make a landscape that is actually from Phragmites in some cases. But in other places, that same species is beneficial and useful. So this has not to do so much with getting rid of or not dealing with invasive species, but rather understanding the subtle distinction between native and non-native, and then invasive at the extreme end of non-native, those which take over. And in other places, so burdock is a plant that in my part of the world, and probably in yours, in some cases is considered invasive, but it is actually native. It's just in degraded landscapes, it tends to proliferate, and yet it has traditional value to Indigenous peoples. It's a medicinal plant. When the city of Toronto tried to put it on the noxious weed list, we made sure that we, tried to raise this issue and to bring Indigenous peoples into the discussion, because it's a plant that has value beyond what we might ascribe to it. So I would just caution people that when using those labels, we're aware of the challenges they present for cultural engagement in rewilding and restoration, for example. It's a good question and one that should be asked.
Now that it looks like they're getting harder. And this is from Ayana, who's one of our students, who's doing a project thinking about land reparation and land back. So I'm going to read it. In a retreat scenario from a small town called Warren, Rhode Island. So how have the Indigenous people you've worked with protected lands in urban and suburban areas? Also, how does this apply or take form when developing new sustainable building practices? How might this apply to housing and community building? There's a lot of questions there, but I guess the question, do you have with the indigenous communities you're working with? I mean, has land back and land preparation taken various forms?
This is a great question. Thank you for asking it. I have not worked with indigenous communities in truly urbanized areas, not in the way that you're suggesting in the question, so I don't have direct experience. But what I would say is there are many indigenous communities engaged in the land back movement across North America who are doing this work in their communities as a model of what communities can look like. My colleague, Sheila McCartney at my university, for example, works with indigenous people in housing in Ontario's north to redesign redesign housing that traditionally had been provided, not traditionally, conventionally had been provided by the federal government as part of the reserve system, and was a kind of plain box suburban style house plunked down and offered to indigenous communities who may live very differently and have very different ways of relating to household and interior exterior relationships and so on. And her work is bringing kind of design charrettes led by indigenous peoples to have authority, autonomy, and recovery of their housing system. So I can't speak to those particulars, but I would suggest you could look at some of her work. That's Sheila McCartney in the Together Lab is doing some of this work. And of course, Indigenous schools of architecture, the MacEwan School in Ontario, the work of my colleagues, Eladia Smoke is doing some of this work as an architect, as is Matthew Hickey of Two Row Architect. Julia, I can send you those links for.
That would be great.
I would let my Indigenous colleagues' work speak for itself, but there certainly are examples there that I think we're going to see more of, and that may enrich our thinking about design when we listen.
Great. There's one more, so I'm going to keep you for a few more minutes, and I hope, Sky, that I'm reading this correctly. It says, if unbuilding and retreating is something beyond my grasp in my present planning role, but I can support design interventions, how would you suggest I approach planning for biodiversity, especially within cities?
That is a fantastic question. Wow. Let me answer, if I may. I have to put my glasses on again to make sure I read it properly. Thank you. So with unbuilding and retreating, yes, that seems the opposite of design, doesn't it? It seems that this is not what we train designers to do in schools of architecture and design. And yet, to use the example in the construction, in building anything, almost half the embodied energy and cost is actually in building something is in unbuilding something else. So the construction industry, in terms of waste generated and extraction, half of that is the other side of the thing we don't see. So I would suggest that unbuilding is actually a big part of architecture. It might not be where designers want to place their energy, but that's certainly part of that circular economy. And what does it have to do with biodiversity? Well, so everything from the site, where we choose to locate new construction, how we adaptively reuse construction can have very much to do with biodiversity. Are we recognizing what species are in that habitat? Whether it's something small from pollination, you're going to hear more from Gina Worth, I know, on design for invertebrates, or are we designing for species that move through our spaces at very particular times of the year, seasonally, or even nocturnally? There are ways to think about that in design that might involve retreat, moving back from a river setback, moving to higher ground. Maybe it's scaling down sometimes, building more modestly. Nobody likes to talk about that. Or also, I would say that, in some of the more tangible examples, when we've done wildlife crossings, we think about multiple species benefits and whether or not we actually need a new piece of infrastructure, or can we adapt an existing piece of infrastructure. So a culvert that's been designed for water flow, inadvertently used by species, could be enhanced for additional species through clever design, for example, without actually building an overpass. Maybe we adapt certain structures that are already being used is literally what I'm saying here. So I hope that gives you some ideas. I'd also close with saying The design of policy is also design for planners. They might want to think about that. It's maybe a different way of thinking about it.
For sure. I told you that was the last one, but I have to ask one more and then we'll stop, I promise, which is, if I may,
Yes, please.
I'm super interested in, as you know, design application. And so, in looking over really the last 10 years and even putting together this lecture series, I'm starting to try to understand the different kinds of subjectivities that are emerging relative to human-animal relations. And, sometimes, I do find examples of coexistence. I'll use the Seattle waterfront by field operations, right? We have pedestrians on top, we've got the salmon below. There's probably no sense of one to the other, right? They coexist and it's really a wonderful project. You've given some examples of mutualism. I guess I'm really trying to understand an example, not that exists in the world, but an example that we design for of entanglement. Can we design for entanglement? Or is that possible? The kind of intimate, as you say, intimate relationship of life and landscape.
Well, that's a beautiful question, Julia, one that you and I should continue to explore together. I think for me, I'm very inspired by the image that I showed at the beginning from my university of the two-row wampum belt, the two people symbolized in the beads walking separately but together. So parallel paths that don't intersect. That's one. Some might say that's coexisting to your demonstration. But I think the entanglement happens when the paths do cross, which increasingly in an urbanized world they do. So, and certainly in our food systems, we're deeply entangled with the biodiversity around us. Some will call this agroecology, that has less to do with the wild and more to do with how our food system is connected to us. Christina Hill, I think, did a great job of talking about this, the biodiverse on the inside out. Biodiversity is within us. And so entanglement for me is more an aspirational way of thinking about how to relate. I'm not sure that it's physical design. I think it might be policy around food ways, for example. It might be also in sometimes, very specific kinds of infrastructural connectivity. If we thought about Richard Weller's World Park idea, or just, what Why is doing on a much larger scale, this landscape connectivity, these pathways wax and wane from more urbanized to less, from deeply connected to people in urban conditions moving with wildlife in different times of the day, to very infrequent points of contact. So like everything, it's probably a gradient. And I think it would be really interesting to document some examples of if there is a physical design possibility, or even, what does that look like? And more importantly, I would say the policies might be thinking about entanglement, or ways that we are already entangled, and yet maybe in some cases we ought to just move slightly apart to give each other more breathing room.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, very provocative now. Yeah, we'll have to think more about that. But well, thank you everyone for joining us. And Nina Marie, really wonderful to have you, and a conversation that must continue.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you for letting me take you a little bit into the evening hour.
Okay, bye. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.